The engine died with a final wheeze, steam rising from the chrome like a dying breath. Marcus Rodriguez coasted his vintage Harley to a stop in front of the last place on earth he wanted to be stranded. The Iron Horse Saloon squatted against the Montana highway like a predator waiting to pounce, its neon sign flickering red against the gathering dusk. Through the grimy windows, he could see leather-clad figures moving in the amber light, their laughter cutting through the cold mountain air like broken glass. Marcus killed the ignition and sat in the silence, his weathered hands still gripping the handlebars. 23 years since his last mission, and his heart still hammered the same rhythm it had in those final moments in Kandahar. The silver wolf-head pendant hanging from his bike's mirror caught the dying sunlight, its 3 small stars seeming to pulse with their own inner fire. He'd sworn he'd never let anyone see it again, never let anyone ask questions he couldn't answer. But here he was, 30 miles from the nearest town, with a dead engine and nowhere else to go. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The saloon's doors swung open, and a mountain of a man stepped onto the wooden porch. Tommy Hammer O'Brien surveyed his domain with the casual confidence of a king, his iron wolves patch stretched across shoulders that had seen more bar fights than most men see sunrises. His eyes locked onto Marcus, taking in the broken-down bike, the military bearing that never quite fades, the way the stranger's hand instinctively moved toward his hip where a sidearm used to rest. "Well, well," Tommy called out, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made grown men step aside. "Looks like we got ourselves a lost lamb." Behind him, the saloon's occupants began filtering onto the porch, a pack of wolves drawn by the scent of vulnerability. "Engine trouble, old man?" Marcus swung his leg over the bike and stood slowly, his back protesting after 400 miles in the saddle. He was older now, grayer, but the steel in his spine hadn't bent an inch. "Just need to use your phone," he said, his voice steady despite the situation. "I'll be out of your hair in 5 minutes. Tommy's grin spread like spilled motor oil. "Now that's not very neighborly, is it, boys? Man breaks down in front of our establishment, and he doesn't even want to wet his whistle?" The pack behind him chuckled, the sound holding all the warmth of a January blizzard. "I insist you come in. Have a drink on the house. We'll get you sorted." Marcus had been in enough hostile territory to recognize when refusing hospitality would be more dangerous than accepting it. He nodded once, then reached for his leather jacket hanging over the bike's seat. As he pulled it on, the pendant swung free for just a moment, catching the light from the saloon's windows. Tommy's eyes tracked the movement, and his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The grin remained, but something predatory awakened behind his eyes. The Iron Horse Saloon was exactly what Marcus had expected, and worse. The air hung thick with cigarette smoke and the sour smell of spilled beer, while classic rock pounded from speakers that had seen better decades. Pool balls clacked against each other like bones in a dice cup, and every conversation seemed to carry an undercurrent of threat. The clientele was a mixture of genuine bikers, wannabe tough guys, and the kind of drifters who ended up in places like this when they'd burned every other bridge. Behind the scarred wooden bar, Betty poured drinks with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to read trouble before it started. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her eyes held the sharp intelligence of a woman who'd survived 40 years of serving alcohol to dangerous men. She glanced up as Marcus entered, taking his measure in a single sweeping look that missed nothing. Tommy gestured toward a bar stool with mock courtesy. "Betty, set this gentleman up with whatever he's drinking. On me." He leaned against the bar, positioning himself so that Marcus would have to look at him to watch the room. "Name's Tommy O'Brien. I run things around here." "And you are?" "Marcus Rodriguez." He accepted the beer Betty slid across the bar but didn't drink it immediately. Years of experience had taught him to keep his hands free and his wits sharp in places like this. "Just passing through on my way to Seattle." Rodriguez, Tommy repeated, rolling the name around like he was tasting wine. That bike of yours, that's a '78 Shovelhead, isn't it? Don't see many of those still running. His eyes drifted toward the window where Marcus's Harley sat under the growing darkness. Especially not ones that well maintained. Must mean something special to you. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always came when civilians started asking questions about things they couldn't understand. It gets me where I need to go. A younger biker with arms covered in amateur tattoos pushed away from the pool table and swaggered over. Hey, Tommy, check this out. Rico's voice carried the belligerent confidence of someone who'd never been truly tested. Old-timer here's got some kind of military bling hanging off his bike. Probably bought it at a pawn shop to look tough. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus's hand stopped halfway to his beer, and his eyes went flat and cold. Tommy held up a hand, sensing the shift in atmosphere, but Rico was too drunk on his own bravado to notice the warning signs. What do you say, Gramps? You one of those stolen valor types? Buy yourself some shiny trinkets and pretend you were somebody important? Rico reached out to slap Marcus on the shoulder, a gesture that looked friendly but carried the weight of a challenge. Marcus moved with a speed that defied his gray hair and weathered face. His hand shot out and caught Rico's wrist in a grip that made the younger man's eyes go wide with sudden pain. For 3 seconds, the only sound in the Iron Horse was the jukebox playing an old Stones song and Rico's sharp intake of breath. I wouldn't, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from leading men into places where some of them wouldn't come back. He released Rico's wrist, but the message had been delivered with crystal clarity. Rico stumbled backward, rubbing his wrist and trying to salvage his dignity. What the hell, man? I was just being friendly. Tommy's eyes had never left Marcus's face during the brief confrontation, and what he saw there made him reassess everything about the stranger. The way Marcus had moved, the controlled violence in that simple gesture, the absolute certainty in his voice. This wasn't some weekend warrior playing dress-up. This was the real thing. Rico, why don't you go finish your game, Tommy suggested, his tone making it clear it wasn't really a suggestion. The younger biker slunk back to the pool table, muttering under his breath but smart enough not to push his luck further. Betty set down the glass she'd been cleaning and moved closer to Marcus. You want some advice, mister? Finish your beer and wait for AAA outside. This crowd gets uglier as the night goes on. Marcus nodded his appreciation for the warning. But before he could respond, the saloon's front door opened with enough force to rattle the windows. The man who entered moved like a shadow given form, all sharp angles and predatory grace. Vincent Viper Blackwood swept the room with pale eyes that seemed to catalog every face, every weapon, every potential threat before settling on Marcus with laser focus. The effect on the Iron Horse's patrons was immediate and unsettling. Conversations died mid-sentence, and even the most belligerent bikers suddenly found their drinks fascinating. Tommy O'Brien, who'd ruled this roost for 15 years, took an involuntary step backward as Viper approached the bar. Tommy, Viper said, his voice carrying an odd accent that suggested expensive schools and old money. I see you've met my friend Marcus. Marcus felt ice form in his veins. 23 years of peace shattered in an instant as he stared into eyes he'd hoped never to see again. Eyes that had looked back at him across a dusty compound in Afghanistan, while American soldiers lay dying and the mission parameters changed by the hour. Hello, Tank? Viper continued, using the call sign that Marcus had buried along with too many good people. I was wondering when you'd surface again. The silence in the Iron Horse was deafening. Even the jukebox seemed to sense the tension and let the current song fade into nothingness. Tommy looked between the two men, recognizing that he'd stumbled into something far beyond his understanding or control. Marcus's hand moved instinctively toward his hip, muscle memory reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Vincent Blackwood, I heard you were dead. Reports of my demise were greatly exaggerated. Viper smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Though the same can't be said for some of our old teammates. Doc Mitchell sends her regards, by the way. Or she would, if she weren't so busy patching up casualties at the VA hospital in Great Falls. The mention of Sarah Mitchell hit Marcus like a physical blow. Doc had saved his life twice during their deployment, once with a tourniquet and surgical skill, once by talking him down from a rooftop when the nightmares got too loud. If Viper knew where she was, if he was threatening her. "What do you want, Vincent?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the storm building in his chest. Viper reached into his jacket with deliberate slowness, giving everyone in the room time to tense up. What he pulled out wasn't a weapon but a photograph, creased and faded with age. He placed it on the bar between them with the reverence of someone laying flowers on a grave. The photo showed 5 soldiers in desert camouflage, their faces young and confident in the way that only came from believing they were invincible. Marcus recognized himself immediately, along with Sarah Doc Mitchell, James Wire Thompson, David Ghost Chen, and Maria Falcon Santos. Delta Force Team Blackout, photographed 3 days before everything went to hell. "Operation Mountain Thunder," Viper said softly. "Remember that one, Tank? Supposed to be a simple extraction. Get in, get the asset, get out. But things got complicated, didn't they?" Marcus stared at the photograph, seeing not just his younger self but the ghosts of the men and women he'd led into that Afghan hellscape. "That mission is classified. Was classified," Viper corrected. "But classification doesn't mean much when the people who wrote the rules are 6 feet under, does it?" He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. "Tell me, Tank, do you still have nightmares about the mountain? Do you still wake up hearing ghosts screaming?" Tommy O'Brien had run the Iron Wolves for 15 years, had survived 3 gang wars and countless bar fights. But he'd never felt power like this crackling between 2 men. Whatever was happening here was bigger than anything he'd ever been part of, and every instinct he'd developed told him to get as far away as possible. But something else held him in place. Something about the way the stranger Tank had moved when Rico challenged him. Something about the pendant hanging from his motorcycle, now that he thought about it. The silver wolf head with 3 stars. Tommy had seen that symbol before, years ago, on a different man in a different bar. A man who'd saved Tommy's life when a drug deal went sideways and the bullets started flying. "Ghost is dead," Marcus said flatly. "They're all dead. Mountain Thunder was a disaster from start to finish." Viper's smile widened. "Are they? All of them?" He produced another photograph, this one obviously recent. It showed a woman in scrubs walking out of a hospital, her gray hair tied back in a practical ponytail. Sarah Mitchell, older but unmistakably alive. "Doc's been asking questions, Tank. Digging into old files, making phone calls to people who should have forgotten we ever existed. She's been wondering what really happened on that mountain. And now, she's got company." The third photograph hit the bar like a bomb. James Wire Thompson, photographed through a telephoto lens as he worked on a cell phone tower outside Billings. Still alive, still in Montana, still carrying secrets that could topple governments. Marcus felt the world tilt on its axis. For 23 years, he'd believed he was the only survivor of Operation Mountain Thunder. He'd carried the guilt of their deaths like stones in his chest, had built his entire post-military life around the belief that he'd failed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His team when they needed him most. Now Viper was telling him that at least 2 of them had survived, were living within 100 miles of where he sat. "What's your game, Vincent?" Marcus asked, his voice hoarse with suppressed emotion. "No game," Viper replied. "Just a reunion. The gang's all here, Tank." "Well, almost all of us. There's just one problem." He leaned back, letting his jacket fall open just enough to reveal the butt of a pistol holstered under his arm. "Someone's been talking. Someone's been sharing stories they shouldn't share with people who shouldn't hear them. And that's bad for everyone's health." The Iron Horse had gone from uncomfortably quiet to tomb silent. Even Betty had stopped pretending to clean glasses and was watching the confrontation with the focused attention of someone trying to decide whether to call the police or just run. Tommy O'Brien made his decision. He pushed away from the bar and walked slowly toward the back of the saloon, fishing a cell phone from his pocket as he moved. But instead of dialing 911, he scrolled through his contacts until he found a number he hadn't called in 5 years. A number that belonged to a man who'd once worn the same silver wolf pendant that now hung from Marcus Rodriguez's motorcycle. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Wire here." "James, it's Tommy O'Brien from the Iron Horse. You need to get down here, now. There's a man here asking about Mountain Thunder, and I think your friend Tank is in serious trouble." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that Tommy thought the call had dropped. When James Thompson finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Tommy's blood run cold. "On my way. Whatever you do, don't let them leave." As Tommy hung up, he caught sight of his own reflection in the mirror behind the bar. The silver wolf pendant he wore on a chain around his neck, usually hidden beneath his shirt, had worked its way into view. 3 stars gleaming in the amber light of the Iron Horse, identical to the one hanging from Marcus Rodriguez's motorcycle. Operation Mountain Thunder had created more ghosts than anyone knew, and tonight they were all coming home. The Iron Horse Saloon had stood on this stretch of Highway 89 for 47 years, weathering Montana winters that could freeze a man's breath in his lungs and summers that baked the asphalt until it shimmered like water. The building itself was a testament to stubborn survival, its log walls chinked with decades of repair work and its tin roof patched with whatever materials were handy when the leaks started. Inside, the walls were lined with the detritus of biker culture spanning 3 generations. Faded photographs of rides long past, patches from clubs that had dissolved in violence or attrition, and enough neon beer signs to light up a small city. The clientele of the Iron Horse represented a cross-section of Montana's forgotten population. There were the lifers, men like Jake Hartwell who'd been coming here since the Carter administration, their faces mapped with scars, and their stories growing taller with each passing year. Jake had lost 3 fingers to a table saw at the lumber mill, and claimed to have outrun the law in 4 states, though anyone who knew him well enough understood that most of his running had been done on foot after his various motorcycles broke down. He held court at the end of the bar, spinning tales to anyone young enough or drunk enough to listen. Near the pool table, Rico Valdez represented the new generation of Iron Horse regulars. 26 years old, with arms covered in tattoos that told the story of a life spent proving himself to men who would never quite accept him, Rico had been coming to the saloon for 3 years without ever truly belonging. His Harley was financed at 23% interest, his leather jacket was store-bought rather than earned, and his swagger was the kind that came from watching too many movies about biker culture. But he was loyal in his own way, and Tommy O'Brien had learned to appreciate loyalty even when it came wrapped in delusion. The women who frequented the Iron Horse were a different breed entirely. There was Monica Clearwater, a Blackfeet woman who could strip and rebuild a motorcycle engine faster than most men could change a tire. She'd earned her respect the hard way, through skill and an absolute refusal to be intimidated by men who thought they owned the world. Her dark hair was usually pulled back in a practical braid, and her hands bore the permanent stains of motor oil and determination. She'd been quietly watching the confrontation between Marcus and Viper from her position near the jukebox, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Betty Kowalski had been tending bar at the Iron Horse longer than anyone could remember, arriving in the early 80s with a baby on her hip and a suitcase full of secrets. She'd outlasted 3 owners, survived 2 armed robberies, and developed an almost supernatural ability to sense trouble before it erupted. Her gray hair was always pulled back in a severe bun, and her pale blue eyes held the accumulated wisdom of someone who'd seen every variation of human stupidity that alcohol could inspire. She kept a Louisville Slugger behind the bar and a .38 revolver in the cash register, but her real weapon was an encyclopedic knowledge of everyone who'd ever darkened the Iron Horse's doorway. The saloon's atmosphere was a carefully maintained ecosystem of controlled chaos. The lighting was deliberately dim, provided by a mixture of neon signs, pool table lamps, and a few bare bulbs that cast harsh shadows in the corners. The air conditioning had given up the ghost sometime during the Clinton administration, leaving the building's climate to the mercy of whatever weather Montana decided to throw at it. In winter, the place was kept habitable by a massive wood-burning stove that Jake fed with scraps from the lumber mill. In summer, the windows were thrown open and everyone just dealt with the heat. The soundtrack of the Iron Horse was provided by a jukebox that had been old when Reagan was president and was now held together by duct tape and prayer. Its selection leaned heavily toward classic rock, country, and the kind of blues that came from real heartbreak rather than manufactured angst. The machine had quirks that regular patrons had learned to navigate. You had to hit B7 twice to get Lynyrd Skynyrd, and anything by Metallica required a swift kick to the right side to prevent the record from skipping. The pool table was similarly temperamental, with a slight warp that made the 8-ball roll toward the corner pocket, and felt that had been patched so many times it looked like a quilt. But, beneath the surface chaos, the Iron Horse operated according to its own rigid code. Disrespect toward Betty or any of the other women was met with swift and decisive action. Fights were allowed, even encouraged, but weapons stayed holstered unless someone's life was genuinely in danger. Debts were paid, promises were kept, and loyalty was valued above almost everything else. It was a place where a man's word still meant something, where handshakes sealed deals worth thousands of dollars, and where the wrong answer to the wrong question could earn you a beating that would keep you in the hospital for weeks. The motorcycle culture that centered around the Iron Horse was equally complex. These weren't the Hollywood version of bikers, all leather and chrome and casual violence. They were working-class men and women who'd found family in the rumble of Harley engines and the freedom of the open road. They were veterans who'd traded military structure for the loose hierarchy of motorcycle clubs, factory workers who spent their weekends chasing the horizon, and outcasts who'd discovered that being different was only a problem if you were alone. The bikes themselves were works of art and engineering, each one reflecting its owner's personality and resources. Tommy O'Brien's 1995 Fat Boy was a testament to mechanical perfection, its chrome so polished it could be seen from space and its engine tuned to a precision that would make a Swiss watchmaker weep. Monica Clearwater's 1982 Ironhead Sportster was built for function over form, its flat black paint job and custom exhaust system announcing her arrival from 3 miles away. Rico's 2015 Street Glide was all flash and financed dreams, but it ran well enough to keep up with the pack. Outside the Iron Horse, the Montana landscape stretched in all directions, like a promise of infinite possibility. The highway cut through rolling hills covered in prairie grass and punctuated by stands of cottonwood trees that turned golden in the fall and stood like skeletons against the winter sky. To the north, the Rocky Mountains rose like a wall between earth and heaven, their peaks snow-capped even in summer, and their slopes dark with pine forests that had never been fully explored. To the south, the land flattened into wheat fields and cattle ranches, each one a small kingdom ruled by families who'd been working the same ground for generations. The nearest town of any size was Riverside, population 800, and declining, where the grain elevator stood like a monument to better times, and the main street was lined with empty storefronts and faded dreams. The Iron Horse was technically within Riverside's city limits, but everyone understood that it existed in its own sovereignty, a neutral zone where the normal rules of civilized society were suspended in favor of older, more primal codes. Weather in this part of Montana was not just a topic of conversation, but a force that shaped every aspect of life. Spring brought floods and tornadoes, summer brought drought and wildfires, fall brought early blizzards that could trap the unwary for days, and winter brought cold that could kill an unprepared man in minutes. The Iron Horse had weathered them all, its thick log walls and sturdy construction proving their worth season after season. Tonight, the weather was building towards something significant. The wind had been picking up all day, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of a storm that would close the highways and trap anyone foolish enough to be caught in the open. The temperature was dropping steadily, and the sky had that peculiar gray color that old-timers recognized as the harbinger of serious weather. It was the kind of night when smart people stayed home, but the Iron Horse was full of people who'd never been accused of being smart. The building itself seemed to sense the approaching storm. The wind rattled the windows and moaned through the gaps in the log walls, while the tin roof creaked and groaned under the pressure of increasingly violent gusts. Inside, the atmosphere grew thicker as the storm approached, as if the building were holding its breath in anticipation of what was coming. Part 3. Protagonist Reveal and Characterization. Marcus Rodriguez had learned to read men the way other people read books, and what he saw in the Iron Horse's clientele was a mixture of genuine danger and manufactured bravado that he'd encountered in dozens of similar establishments, from Tijuana to Tacoma. The difference was that here, in this forgotten corner of Montana, the danger felt more honest somehow, less performative, and more rooted in the kind of desperation that came from being forgotten by a world that had moved on without them. His motorcycle, the 1978 Harley-Davidson Shovelhead that had carried him from Seattle to here, was more than just transportation. It was a time machine, a meditation device, and a confession booth, all rolled into one. He'd bought it from a Vietnam veteran in Tacoma who'd been dying of lung cancer and needed the money for treatment. The old soldier had looked at Marcus with eyes that recognized their own kind and had said, "She's been good to me, hope she's good to you too." That was 11 years ago, and Marcus had put over 100,000 miles on the bike since then, chasing horizons and running from ghosts that never seemed to tire of the chase. The pendant hanging from the bike's mirror was the only visible reminder of his military service, though his body carried a dozen invisible scars that told the real story. The silver wolf head with its 3 stars had been crafted by a jeweler in Kandahar who'd lost 2 sons to an IED and had spent his remaining years creating beautiful things as a form of defiance against the ugliness of war. Marcus had commissioned it during his last deployment, back when he'd believed that symbols meant something and that brotherhood was stronger than politics. Each of the 3 stars represented a member of his team who hadn't made it home. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Phoenix Walsh, who died when their convoy hit a roadside bomb outside Kabul. Corporal Michael Diesel Johnson, who'd been killed by a sniper while providing covering fire for a medical evacuation. And Specialist Lisa Ace Thompson, who'd survived 2 tours only to die by suicide 6 months after returning home. Another casualty of a war that followed its veterans across the ocean. The Wolfhead itself was a tribute to the living, the members of Delta Force Team Blackout, who'd supposedly died during Operation Mountain Thunder. For 23 years, Marcus had believed that he was the only survivor of that mission, that his decision to abort the operation had cost the lives of his teammates. The guilt had followed him through a decade of therapy, 3 failed relationships, and enough alcohol to float a battleship. He'd built his entire post-military identity around the belief that he was a failure, a leader who'd cracked under pressure and gotten good people killed. His civilian life had been a series of jobs that required his particular skills but didn't ask too many questions about where he'd acquired them. He'd worked security for oil companies in North Dakota, had done private investigation work in Denver, and had spent 3 years as a fishing guide in Alaska, where the silence of the wilderness had been balm for wounds that wouldn't heal. But no matter where he went or what he did, he carried the weight of mountain thunder with him like a stone in his chest. The decision to ride to Seattle had been impulse born of desperation. His VA therapist had suggested that visiting the Vietnam Veterans Memorial might help him process his survivor's guilt, and Marcus had figured that if he was going to confront ghosts, he might as well do it properly. The ride was supposed to be therapeutic, a chance to think through 2 decades of unresolved trauma while the miles rolled by beneath his wheels. He'd been making good time until the engine started acting up outside Great Falls. The Shovelhead was a reliable machine, but it was also 46 years old and had been ridden hard by its previous owner. Marcus had the mechanical skills to keep it running, But some problems required parts that weren't available at gas stations, and the nearest Harley dealer was 200 miles away in Billings. The breakdown in front of the Iron Horse was exactly the kind of situation that Marcus had spent years learning to avoid. He'd developed an almost supernatural ability to sense trouble, to read the subtle signs that indicated when a bar or a town or a situation was likely to explode into violence. But his attention had been focused on the bike's engine problems, and by the time he'd recognized the danger, he was already committed to the confrontation. Now, sitting at the bar with Viper's photographs spread before him like tarot cards predicting disaster, Marcus felt the careful walls he'd built around his emotions beginning to crack. The images of Sarah Mitchell and James Thompson were like messages from the dead, proof that the story he'd been telling himself for 23 years was built on lies. If they were alive, if they'd been living their own lives while he'd been drowning in guilt, then everything he'd believed about himself was wrong. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. If his teammates had survived Mountain Thunder, then maybe he wasn't the failure he'd believed himself to be. But if they were alive, that meant they'd chosen to stay hidden, to let him believe they were dead. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound, because it suggested that his brotherhood with them had been as illusory as his guilt. Marcus's military training had taught him to compartmentalize, to lock away emotions that might interfere with the mission at hand. But after 23 years of civilian life, those skills had atrophied, and he found himself struggling to maintain the cold professionalism that had once been second nature. The photographs on the bar were more than just evidence of his teammates' survival. They were proof that his entire post-military identity had been built on a foundation of lies. The silver wolf pendant caught the light as he shifted position, and Marcus found himself thinking about the Afghan jeweler who'd crafted it. The old man had lost everything to the war, but had refused to let it destroy his ability to create beauty. Pain is just another kind of material, he'd told Marcus in broken English. Like silver or gold, you can make something beautiful from it, or you can let it poison you. Your choice. Marcus had chosen poison, had let his guilt and self-recrimination eat away at him like acid. But now, faced with evidence that his sacrifice had been meaningless, he felt something else beginning to stir in his chest. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of cold fury that he hadn't experienced since his last firefight in Afghanistan. Someone had lied to him, had stolen 23 years of his life, based on a deception so complete that he'd never thought to question it. The man sitting across from him, Vincent Viper Blackwood, had been part of that deception. Marcus could see it in his eyes, in the way he'd revealed the photographs, with the careful timing of someone who'd rehearsed this moment. Viper had known that the other members of Team Blackout were alive, had probably known for years, and had chosen to let Marcus suffer in ignorance. But why? What possible reason could there be for such elaborate cruelty? Marcus had served his country with honor, had followed orders even when those orders led into hell, and had never betrayed the trust placed in him by his superiors or his subordinates. He'd earned the right to know the truth, to understand what had really happened during Operation Mountain Thunder, and why his teammates had chosen to disappear rather than come home. The answer, Marcus realized, was sitting right in front of him. Viper's presence at the Iron Horse wasn't coincidence. It was orchestration. He'd known that Marcus would break down here, had probably arranged for the engine failure somehow. This entire confrontation was staged, a carefully planned revelation designed to force Marcus into a position where he had no choice but to play along with whatever game Viper was running. The knowledge should have been frightening, but instead Marcus felt a familiar calm settling over him. This was what he'd been trained for, what he'd spent years preparing for, even if he'd never expected to use those skills again. He was back in the field, back in a situation where the rules were clear, and the stakes were life and death. After 23 years of civilian uncertainty, there was something almost comforting about returning to the world, where problems were solved with violence and loyalty was measured in blood. Part 4, Opposition Forces and Initial Conflict. Rico Valdez had been spoiling for a fight all evening, his mood darkened by a combination of cheap whiskey and the kind of professional frustration that came from being 26 years old and still living in his mother's basement. The confrontation with the stranger had been exactly what he'd been looking for, a chance to prove himself in front of Tommy O'Brien and the other Iron Wolves. The fact that it had ended with his wrist nearly broken and his dignity in shreds only made him more determined to salvage the situation. "I don't care if he's some kind of special forces ninja," Rico muttered to his drinking companion, a skinny meth head named Dale who'd been banned from every other bar in a 50-mile radius. "Nobody disrespects me in front of my people." "Nobody?" Dale nodded sagely, his dilated pupils giving him the appearance of a man who'd seen profound truths hidden from the rest of humanity. "You gotta stand up for yourself, Rico. Can't let some old man make you look weak." The problem with Rico's analysis was that it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the dynamics at play in the Iron Horse. He'd been coming to the saloon for 3 years, but he'd never truly grasped the complex hierarchy that governed the place. Tommy O'Brien was the undisputed king of this particular hill, but his authority was based on respect earned through decades of smart decisions and careful relationship management. Rico's position in the pecking order was considerably lower, and his attempt to challenge a stranger had been seen by the other patrons as presumptuous at best and suicidal at worst. But Rico was too young and too drunk to understand the subtle social cues that should have warned him off. He'd grown up on a steady diet of action movies and gangster films, where respect was taken at gunpoint, and backing down was a sign of weakness. The fact that he was outgunned, outclassed, and out of his depth didn't factor into his calculations because he'd never learned to accurately assess threats. The stranger sitting at the bar radiated a kind of controlled violence that Rico had never encountered before. It wasn't the loud, performative aggression of men who'd learned to fight in bars and parking lots. It was the quiet confidence of someone who'd killed professionally and could do so again without losing sleep. But Rico's worldview didn't include categories for that level of lethality, so he interpreted Marcus's restraint as weakness rather than professionalism. "I'm going to teach that old bastard some manners," Rico announced, loud enough for half the bar to hear. "Show him what happens when you mess with the Iron Wolves." Jake Hartwell, who'd been nursing the same beer for the past hour while pretending to watch the confrontation between Marcus and Viper, turned his weathered face toward Rico with the expression of a man watching a child play with dynamite. "Son, you might want to reconsider that particular course of action." "Why?" Rico's voice carried the belligerent edge of someone who'd mistaken alcohol for courage. "Because he's older? Because he's got some fancy military jewelry? I've been in plenty of fights, old man. I can handle myself." Jake's laugh was dry as desert sand. "Boy, I've been coming to this place since before you were born, and I've seen plenty of tough guys walk through that door. Most of them were all hat and no cattle, if you know what I mean. But every now and then, you get someone who's the real deal. Someone who's been places and done things that would turn your hair white." Rico's response was interrupted by the arrival of 3 men who'd been sitting at a corner table, quietly nursing beers and playing cards. The Iron Wolves had a loose organizational structure, but these 3 represented the club's muscle, the enforcers who handled problems that couldn't be solved with conversation. Their leader was a man named Crash Morrison, a former Army Ranger who'd been dishonorably discharged after a bar fight in Seoul left 2 military policemen in the hospital. Crash stood 6 feet 4 inches and weighed 250 pounds, most of it muscle earned through years of manual labor and prison yard workouts. His face was a road map of old fights, with a crooked nose that had been broken at least 3 times, and a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. His arms were covered in tattoos that told the story of his military service and subsequent incarceration, and his hands were the size of dinner plates. "Rico," Crash said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never had to repeat himself, "you need to sit down and shut up before you get yourself killed." But Rico was beyond reason now, his fragile ego unable to withstand another public humiliation. "I'm not backing down from some old man with a broken motorcycle. This is our place, and he needs to learn some respect." The confrontation was attracting attention from throughout the saloon. Monica Clearwater looked up from the engine manual she'd been studying, her dark eyes assessing the situation with the cool professionalism of someone who'd survived more bar fights than she cared to remember. Betty Kowalski continued polishing glasses, but her movements had become more deliberate, and her eyes never left the unfolding drama. Even the jukebox seemed to sense the tension, finishing its current song and falling silent rather than moving on to the next selection. The only sounds in the Iron Horse were the low murmur of conversation from the corner tables and the steady tick of the Budweiser clock above the bar. Tommy O'Brien had been watching the situation develop with growing concern. He'd built his reputation on maintaining order in the Iron Horse, on ensuring that conflicts were resolved before they escalated into the kind of violence that brought unwanted attention from law enforcement. But this situation was different, complicated by factors that he didn't fully understand. The stranger at the bar was clearly military, and not just any military. Tommy had served 2 tours in Iraq with the 101st Airborne, and he'd learned to recognize the subtle signs that marked men who'd seen serious combat. The way Marcus held himself, the controlled economy of his movements, the way his eyes constantly scanned the room for threats, these were the habits of someone who'd spent years in places where inattention meant death. But it was the pendant hanging from his motorcycle that had really caught Tommy's attention. The silver wolf head with 3 stars was identical to the one that Tommy wore on a chain around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt where casual observers wouldn't notice it. That pendant had been given to him by a man named Wire, a former Delta Force operator who'd saved Tommy's life during a drug deal gone wrong in Billings 5 years earlier. Wire had never talked about his military service, had never shared details about where he'd earned the scars that covered his arms and back. But he'd worn the same pendant, and when Tommy had asked about it, Wire had simply said, "It's for the ones who didn't make it home." Tommy had understood that he was seeing something private, something that civilians weren't meant to understand, and he'd never pressed for more information. But now, faced with another man wearing an identical pendant, Tommy was beginning to understand that he'd stumbled into something far more complex than a simple bar fight. The arrival of the man called Viper had only confirmed his suspicions. This wasn't random, it was orchestrated, and Tommy was starting to realize that his saloon had been chosen as the venue for a reunion that had been years in the making. The phone call he'd made to Wire had been instinctive, a recognition that forces beyond his understanding were at work. But as he watched Rico work himself into a lather, Tommy realized that he might have made a mistake. If Wire was part of whatever was happening here, then his arrival would only add another volatile element to an already dangerous situation. Rico's voice was getting louder, his gestures more aggressive, and Tommy could see that the situation was about to spiral out of control. The other patrons were beginning to choose sides, not based on any understanding of the real issues at stake, but simply on tribal loyalty and the kind of mob psychology that turned minor disagreements into full-scale riots. "That's enough," Tommy said, his voice carrying the authority of ownership and years of experience in managing difficult situations. "Rico, you're done for the night. Go home and sleep it off." But Rico was too far gone to recognize the lifeline being thrown to him. "I'm not going anywhere until that old man apologizes for disrespecting me. This is Iron Wolf's territory, and he needs to learn that we don't take shit from nobody." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down in the middle of the saloon. Marcus Rodriguez slowly turned on his bar stool, his movements deliberate and unhurried, and fixed Rico with a stare that should have frozen the blood in the younger man's veins. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried clearly throughout the suddenly silent room. "Son, you've got about 10 seconds to walk away from this before you do something that's going to change your life forever. And not in a good way." Rico's response was to reach for the pool cue, leaning against the nearest table, his fingers wrapping around the familiar weight of polished wood. "I don't think so, old man. I think it's time someone taught you some manners." The transformation in Marcus was subtle, but unmistakable. The tired, middle-aged man who'd been nursing a beer and trying to avoid trouble disappeared, replaced by something much more dangerous. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his weight moving to the balls of his feet, and his hands fell to his sides in a deceptively casual gesture that positioned them for maximum effectiveness. "Rico," Tommy said, his voice carrying a note of genuine concern. "Don't do this. You're about to make a mistake that you won't be able to take back." But Rico was beyond hearing warnings or recognizing danger. He raised the pool cue like a club, his eyes wild with alcohol and adrenaline, and took a step toward Marcus. "Let's see how tough you are when you're not sucker-punching people, old man." The fight lasted exactly 7 seconds. Part 5. Catalyst Moment and Game Changer. The first indication that Rico had made a catastrophic miscalculation came when the pool cue snapped in half against Marcus's raised forearm, without producing so much as a grunt of pain. The second indication came when Marcus's other hand shot out with the speed of a striking snake, catching Rico by the throat and lifting him clear off the ground before slamming him down onto the nearest table with enough force to crack the wood. The transformation was so swift and complete that most of the Iron Horse's patrons weren't entirely sure what they'd witnessed. One moment Rico had been advancing with his improvised weapon. The next he was pinned to a table with Marcus Rodriguez's hand wrapped around his windpipe and the splintered remains of the pool cue scattered on the floor around them. "Now," Marcus said, his voice carrying the conversational tone of someone discussing the weather, "I'm going to explain something to you, and I want you to listen very carefully. I came in here for a drink and a phone call. I didn't come here to hurt anybody, and I didn't come here to prove anything to anybody. But you've decided to make this personal, and that changes the rules of engagement." Rico's eyes bulged as he struggled to breathe, his hands clawing uselessly at Marcus's iron grip. The casual strength being displayed was something beyond his experience, the kind of physical control that came from years of training and practical application. This wasn't a bar fight. It was a demonstration of skills that had been honed in places where mistakes meant death. "You see," Marcus continued, his grip tightening just enough to make his point clear, "I've killed men for a living. Professional soldiers, trained killers, people who were a hell of a lot more dangerous than you'll ever be. And I was good at my job. Very good. The only reason you're still breathing is because I choose to let you breathe." The silence in the Iron Horse was so complete that the sound of Rico's labored breathing seemed to echo off the walls. Even the most hardened patrons were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something far removed from the usual barroom brawl. This was a predator toying with prey, a professional demonstrating the gap between real violence and the theatrical aggression that passed for toughness in civilian life. Crash Morrison had been moving toward the confrontation, his massive frame cutting through the crowd with the inevitability of an avalanche, but he stopped short when he saw the look in Marcus's eyes, recognizing something that made his own prison-hardened instincts scream warnings. This wasn't someone who could be intimidated or overpowered. This was someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of killing and had never lost the edge. "Let him go," Crash said, his voice carefully neutral. "He's learned his lesson." Marcus's eyes flicked toward the big man, taking his measure in a single glance. "Have you? Because if you're thinking about making this a group effort, I should mention that I'm not particularly worried about the odds." The challenge was delivered with the same conversational tone, but everyone in the room understood that it was absolutely serious. This wasn't bravado or empty posturing. It was a simple statement of fact from someone who'd faced worse odds and emerged victorious. The casual confidence was more intimidating than any amount of shouting or threats could have been. Tommy O'Brien realized that he was standing at a crossroads that would define the rest of his life. He could side with Rico, support his own people regardless of the consequences, and almost certainly watch his bar become a crime scene. Or he could try to de-escalate the situation, even if it meant backing down from a customer who'd made a fool of one of his own. The decision was made for him by the sound of motorcycle engines approaching from the highway. Not just one or two bikes, but a full convoy, their synchronized rumble growing louder as they drew closer to the Iron Horse. Through the saloon's windows, the patrons could see headlights cutting through the darkness, at least a dozen machines riding in the tight formation that spoke of military precision rather than casual brotherhood. Marcus released Rico, who collapsed to the floor gasping and clutching his throat. But his attention was focused on the approaching engines, his head cocked like a hunting dog catching a familiar scent. "Wire always did like to make an entrance," he murmured, speaking to himself as much as to anyone else in the room. The engines shut off in unison, and the sudden silence was somehow more ominous than the noise had been. Through the windows, dark figures could be seen dismounting from their machines, their movements economical and purposeful. They weren't the casual bikers who typically frequented the Iron Horse. These were soldiers, and they were here for a purpose. Vincent Blackwood had been watching the confrontation with the detached interest of someone observing a laboratory experiment. Now he straightened in his chair, his pale eyes sharpening as he recognized the implications of the new arrivals. "It seems your friend got my message," he said to Marcus. "Though I have to admit, I wasn't expecting quite such a dramatic response." The Iron Horse's front door opened, and James Wire Thompson stepped into the amber light of the saloon. He was older than Marcus remembered, his dark hair now streaked with silver, and his face lined with the accumulated stress of 23 years of civilian life. But his eyes were the same, sharp and intelligent, and his movements carried the controlled grace of someone who'd never forgotten his training. Behind Wire came two other figures that Marcus recognized despite the passage of years. David Ghost Chen looked like he'd aged well, his compact frame still carrying the wiry strength that had made him the team's best reconnaissance specialist. His Asian features were more lined than Marcus remembered, but his eyes held the same quiet intensity that had made him so effective at moving unseen through hostile territory. The third figure was a woman, tall and athletic, with graying blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Sarah Doc Mitchell had traded her military fatigues for civilian clothes, but she still moved with the confident bearing of someone who'd spent years making life-and-death decisions under pressure. Her medical bag was slung over her shoulder, and her eyes were already scanning the room for potential casualties. "Well," Wire said, his voice carrying the same dry humor that Marcus remembered from their time together in Afghanistan, "this is cozy. Nothing like a family reunion in a biker bar to really set the mood." The temperature in the Iron Horse seemed to drop 10 degrees as the implications of the gathering became clear. These weren't just random strangers who'd happened to encounter each other. They were members of a unit that had supposedly been wiped out 23 years ago, ghosts returning to settle accounts that should have been closed long ago. Tommy O'Brien felt the silver wolf pendant beneath his shirt growing warm against his skin, as if it were responding to the presence of its siblings. The pendant had been given to him by Wire during a moment of shared danger, but he'd never understood its true significance. Now, surrounded by people who wore identical symbols, he was beginning to realize that he'd been drafted into something far larger than he'd ever imagined. Rico Valdez had managed to pull himself to his feet, his hand still massaging his bruised throat. The pain and humiliation had sobered him somewhat, but it had also filled him with a rage that bordered on the irrational. He'd been made to look like a fool in front of his own people, and the arrival of more strangers only made the situation more intolerable. "I don't care how many friends you brought," Rico croaked, his voice still hoarse from Marcus's grip. "This is still our place, and you're still not welcome here." The words were barely out of his mouth when Ghost Chen moved, with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of close-quarters combat. Rico found himself face down on the floor with his arm twisted behind his back in a joint lock that would break bones if he struggled too hard. The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds, and Ghost hadn't even appeared to exert himself. "Some people," Ghost said conversationally, "never learn when to quit talking." Wire surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of someone who'd walked into more than his share of hostile situations. The Iron Horse's patrons were tense, but not openly hostile, suggesting that the situation hadn't yet escalated beyond the point of no return. Tommy O'Brien was clearly trying to maintain control of his establishment, while the mysterious figure at the bar watched everything with the detached interest of someone who'd orchestrated the entire confrontation. "Vincent," Wire said, acknowledging Blackwood's presence with a slight nod. "I was wondering when you'd surface again. Though I have to admit, I wasn't expecting you to use Tank as bait." Blackwood's smile was as cold as mountain snow. "Hello, Wire. You're looking well, considering. 23 years of civilian life seems to have agreed with you. It has its moments, Wire replied, though I get the feeling those moments are about to come to an end. The reunion of Delta Force Team Blackout was taking place in the most unlikely of venues, but the location seemed oddly appropriate. The scar running down Marcus Rodriguez's left forearm told a story that no civilian would ever fully understand. It wasn't the clean line of a surgical procedure or the jagged tear of an accident, but the deliberate mark left by shrapnel from an improvised explosive device that had been packed with ball bearings and rusty nails. The bomber had been a 14-year-old boy whose older brother had been killed in a coalition airstrike, and Marcus had watched the kid's eyes in the split second before the device detonated, seeing hatred so pure it burned like acid. That moment, frozen in time like a photograph he could never throw away, had taught Marcus more about the true cost of war than all his military training combined. It wasn't just about the physical wounds that healed badly or the psychological scars that never healed at all. It was about the moment when you realized that the enemy you were fighting had faces and families and reasons for their hatred that made perfect sense from their perspective. The kid with the bomb hadn't been evil. He'd been broken, just like Marcus himself would be broken years later when the full weight of what he'd done and seen finally caught up with him. The transition from active duty to civilian life had been like stepping off a cliff into an abyss that had no bottom. The Army had provided him with a transition course, 6 weeks of seminars and workshops designed to help soldiers adjust to life outside the military. They'd covered practical topics like resume writing and job interviews, but they'd completely ignored the existential crisis that came with trying to find meaning in a world that suddenly seemed trivial and pointless after years of life-and-death decisions. Marcus had tried college first, using his GI Bill benefits to pursue a degree in criminal justice that he'd never finished. The classroom discussions about theoretical crime and punishment had seemed absurd to someone who'd seen justice dispensed at the end of a rifle barrel, in places where law enforcement meant whoever had the most ammunition. His fellow students were earnest young people who debated the ethics of police surveillance while Marcus sat in the back row, thinking about villages where the only law was the one enforced by tribal elders who'd never heard of constitutional rights. The jobs that followed had been a series of compromises, each one a step further away from the person he'd been and the skills that defined him. Security work paid well but felt like playing dress-up, wearing a uniform and carrying equipment, while pretending that directing traffic at construction sites was somehow related to the combat experience that had shaped him. Private investigation offered more intellectual challenge, but required him to spy on cheating spouses and insurance fraudsters, using skills that had once been employed to track terrorists and insurgents. The worst part wasn't the work itself, but the constant need to translate his experiences into language that civilians could understand, without being overwhelmed or frightened. When people asked about his military service, he'd learned to give them sanitized versions of the truth, talking about overseas deployments and specialized training, without mentioning the texture of blood when it dried on desert sand, or the way a man's eyes looked when he knew he was about to die. The nightmares had started 6 months after his discharge delayed onset trauma that the VA doctors explained was common among combat veterans. But knowing that it was normal didn't make it any less terrifying to wake up in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs as his mind struggled to separate the bedroom from the battlefield. Sleep became something to be avoided rather than welcomed, and Marcus had spent years functioning on 3 or 4 hours of rest per night, sustained by caffeine and the kind of controlled desperation that came from knowing that unconsciousness meant returning to places he'd rather forget. The motorcycle had been therapy, purchased on impulse from a dying veteran who'd recognized something familiar in Marcus's eyes. The 1978 Shovelhead was a machine from a simpler time, when motorcycles were built to be repaired rather than replaced, and when the relationship between rider and machine was intimate and personal. Working on the engine became a form of meditation, a way to focus his mind on immediate, solvable problems rather than the larger questions that had no answers. Riding provided a different kind of healing, a sense of forward motion that felt like progress, even when he wasn't sure where he was going. The highway became his therapist's office, a place where he could think through his trauma without interruption or judgment. The wind and engine noise created a cocoon of white noise that drowned out the voices in his head, while the physical demands of controlling a powerful machine on twisting mountain roads required a level of concentration that left no room for dwelling on the past. The pendant hanging from his bike's mirror had been both talisman and burden, a reminder of the people he'd failed to save and the mission that had ended in disaster. The Afghan jeweler who'd crafted it had been a man named Khalil Nazari, whose workshop had been destroyed 3 times by various factions, but who'd rebuilt it each time with stubborn determination. Khalil had lost 2 sons to the war, but had refused to let hatred consume him, channeling his grief into creating beautiful objects that defied the ugliness surrounding them. "Pain is like metal," Khalil had told Marcus during one of their conversations, his English stilted but eloquent. "You can let it rust and corrupt everything it touches, or you can forge it into something that serves a purpose. The choice is always yours to make." Marcus had chosen rust for 23 years, letting his guilt and self-recrimination eat away at him like acid on steel. He'd isolated himself from relationships that might require him to explain his past, had avoided situations that might trigger memories of combat, and had built his entire civilian identity around the belief that he was damaged goods, a broken soldier who'd cracked under pressure when his team needed him most. The revelation that his teammates were alive changed everything, not just about the past, but about the person he'd become in the years since Mountain Thunder. If Sarah and Wire and the others had survived, if they'd made conscious decisions to disappear rather than face whatever consequences awaited them, then his guilt had been not just pointless, but actively harmful. He'd wasted more than 2 decades mourning people who were living their own lives, carrying shame for failures that might not have been failures at all. But with that realization came a darker understanding. Someone had wanted him to believe his team was dead. Someone had orchestrated an elaborate deception that had stolen 23 years of his life, had let him suffer in isolation while his teammates went on to build new identities and new lives. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound, because it suggested that everything he'd believed about loyalty and brotherhood had been an illusion. The man responsible for that deception was sitting 10 feet away, sipping whiskey and watching the reunion unfold, with the satisfaction of a chess master executing a long-planned strategy. Vincent Blackwood had always been an enigma, even during their time together in Afghanistan. He'd appeared in their unit without explanation, carrying orders that came from sources so classified that even their commanding officer hadn't been fully briefed on his mission parameters. Marcus remembered the day Blackwood had arrived at their forward operating base, stepping off a helicopter that had no markings and carried no identification. He'd been introduced as a liaison officer with expertise in special projects, but his knowledge of local terrain and insurgent tactics suggested experience that went far beyond conventional military training. He'd fit seamlessly into their team dynamic, proving himself in combat and earning their trust through demonstrated competence rather than rank or credentials. Now, looking at Blackwood across the smoky interior of the Iron Horse, Marcus could see details that his younger self had missed or ignored. The man's accent wasn't quite right for someone who'd grown up in the Midwest, as his file indicated. His knowledge of languages and cultures suggested education that went beyond military training. Most tellingly, his emotional responses to combat had been different from those of soldiers who'd learned to kill for their country. Blackwood had displayed the cold efficiency of someone who'd been killing for other reasons long before he'd put on a uniform. The photographs on the bar told another story, one of surveillance and patience that suggested Blackwood had been watching all of them for years. The images of Sarah at the VA hospital and Wire working on cell towers weren't casual snapshots, but carefully composed intelligence photographs, the kind that required planning and resources. Someone had been tracking the surviving members of Team Blackout, documenting their civilian lives, and waiting for the right moment to bring them back together. Marcus felt the familiar weight of tactical assessment settling over his mind, the clinical analysis that had kept him alive through 3 tours of combat. Blackwood's presence at the Iron Horse wasn't coincidence. It was the culmination of a plan that had been years in the making. The breakdown of Marcus's motorcycle had probably been arranged, a mechanical failure induced at precisely the right location to force this confrontation. Even the timing felt orchestrated, bringing all the players together when the approaching storm would isolate them from outside interference. The question was why? What possible reason could Blackwood have for reuniting a team that had been scattered for more than 2 decades? The official records of Operation Mountain Thunder were classified at levels that would keep them hidden for another 30 years, and all the participants were supposedly dead. Bringing them back together risked exposure of secrets that powerful people had gone to great lengths to bury. The answer, Marcus realized, was sitting in the photographs that Blackwood had placed on the bar with such theatrical precision. These weren't just proof that his teammates were alive. They were evidence that someone else knew they were alive. The surveillance photos suggested a level of resources and organization that went beyond individual curiosity or personal vendetta. Someone with serious backing had been tracking the survivors of Mountain Thunder, and that meant the mission's secrets were no longer as buried as everyone had believed. Marcus's assessment was interrupted by the sound of Rico Valdez trying to work himself free from Ghost Chen's restraining hold. The young biker's struggles were creating a distraction that could escalate into serious violence, if not handled carefully. The Iron Horse's other patrons were watching the confrontation with the fascination of people who'd never seen real professionals at work, but their loyalty to Rico and their territorial instincts could turn dangerous if they decided to intervene en masse. Tommy O'Brien was clearly struggling with divided loyalties, torn between his obligation to protect his customers and his growing understanding that the strangers in his bar represented forces beyond his ability to control or comprehend. The pendant hidden beneath his shirt was a constant reminder that he owed his life to one of these men, but that debt of gratitude was being tested by the threat they posed to the stability of his world. Marcus made his decision with the same cold calculation that had served him well in combat. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, and walked toward where Rico was pinned on the floor. Ghost looked up at his approach, reading the intent in Marcus's eyes, and nodding slightly before releasing his hold on the younger man. Rico scrambled to his feet, his face flushed with humiliation and rage, his hand moving instinctively toward the knife he kept clipped to his belt. But before he could draw the weapon, Marcus stepped close enough to speak quietly, his voice pitched so that only Rico could hear the words. "Son, you're about 30 seconds away from getting yourself killed by people who've forgotten more about violence than you'll ever learn. The smart play here is to walk out that door and keep walking until you're somewhere else. Anywhere else." Rico's hand stilled on the knife handle, some survival instinct finally penetrating the fog of alcohol and wounded pride. Up close, he could see details that had been invisible from across the room. The way Marcus's eyes constantly tracked movement, the scars that showed through the opening of his shirt, the absolute stillness that came from someone who'd learned to conserve energy for when it would be needed most. "This isn't over," Rico muttered, but the words lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," Marcus replied with finality that left no room for argument. "It's over because you're going to make it over. Because you're smart enough to recognize when you're outclassed and mature enough to walk away from a fight you can't win." Rico looked around the room, taking in the faces of his fellow Iron Wolves, and seeing something in their expressions that sobered him completely. Even Crash Morrison, the club's enforcer and Rico's personal hero, was shaking his head slightly, a clear signal that continuing this confrontation would be suicide rather than courage. Without another word, Rico turned and walked toward the door, his departure creating a vacuum of tension that left everyone in the room reassessing their positions. The immediate threat of violence had passed, but the underlying conflict remained unresolved, simmering beneath the surface, like a coal seam fire that could erupt without warning. Marcus returned to his position at the bar, but his attention was now fully focused on the larger dynamics at play. The arrival of his former teammates had confirmed his suspicions about Blackwood's orchestration, but it had also raised new questions about what had really happened during Operation Mountain Thunder, and why its secrets were suddenly worth resurrecting after more than 2 decades of carefully maintained silence. The storm building outside the Iron Horse was nothing compared to the one brewing within its walls, as ghosts from a buried mission prepared to confront truths that had been hidden in classified files and protected by the graves of men who died to keep them secret. Part 4. Opposition Forces and Initial Conflict extended. The departure of Rico Valdez from the Iron Horse created a power vacuum that several people immediately moved to fill, each representing different aspects of the opposition that Marcus and his reunited team would face in the hours to come. The most immediate threat came from Crash Morrison, who'd been quietly assessing the tactical situation from his corner table, while his nominal subordinate made a fool of himself with dramatic gestures and empty threats. Crash had earned his nickname during his third deployment to Iraq, when an IED explosion had thrown his armored vehicle 40 feet through the air and left him unconscious for 6 hours. When he'd awakened in a field hospital, his first words had been a joke about landing hard, and the name had stuck through his remaining time in the service. But the explosion had done more than provide him with a colorful moniker. It had scrambled something fundamental in his brain, leaving him with a hair-trigger temper and a complete inability to back down from confrontations once they'd begun. His military service record was a study in contradictions, showing exceptional courage under fire combined with a pattern of insubordination and violence that had eventually led to his dismissal from the Army. The incident in Seoul that had ended his career had involved 2 military policemen who tried to break up a bar fight that Crash had been losing badly. Instead of accepting defeat, he'd escalated the situation by using a beer bottle as a weapon, leaving one megapixel with a skull fracture and the other with a shattered jaw. The 3 years he'd spent in military prison had only made him more dangerous, teaching him to channel his violence more efficiently while reinforcing his belief that authority was something to be challenged rather than respected. His release from Leavenworth had been followed by a series of jobs in civilian security, each one ending when his inability to de-escalate conflicts became a liability that outweighed his undeniable effectiveness in purely physical confrontations. Tommy O'Brien had hired Crash during the Iron Wolves' expansion into drug distribution, recognizing that the club needed muscle that could handle both rival gangs and law enforcement with equal efficiency. Crash's military training and prison experience made him uniquely qualified for work that required violence to be applied with precision rather than passion, and his complete lack of fear made him invaluable in situations where intimidation was more important than actual combat. But now, watching the casual way that Marcus and his team had neutralized Rico's challenge, Crash was experiencing something he hadn't felt since that IED explosion in Anbar province: genuine uncertainty about his ability to control a situation through force. The strangers at the bar moved with a level of professional competence that reminded him of the Delta Force operators he'd occasionally worked with during his time in Iraq, and their weapons discipline suggested training that went far beyond anything he'd encountered in civilian life. The second tier of opposition came from the Iron Wolves membership itself, men who'd built their identities around the belief that their club was the dominant force in a 100-mile radius of Highway 89. Most of them were working-class guys who'd found family and purpose in motorcycle culture, but a significant minority were genuine criminals who used the club's colors as cover for activities that ranged from drug distribution to human trafficking. Dale Morrison, Crash's younger brother and the club's primary connection to the regional methamphetamine trade, represented the purely mercenary faction of the Iron Wolves. Unlike his sibling, Dale had never served in the military and had no experience with actual combat, but he'd spent years developing networks of suppliers and distributors that made him valuable to organizations much larger and more dangerous than a small-town motorcycle club. Dale's paranoia was legendary, even among people whose livelihoods depended on avoiding law enforcement attention. He carried 3 different cell phones, changed his appearance on a weekly basis, and trusted no one completely, not even his own brother. His survival in the methamphetamine trade was due entirely to his assumption that everyone he encountered was either an undercover police officer or a rival dealer planning to eliminate him, and he'd learned to spot surveillance and detect threats with an accuracy that bordered on supernatural. The arrival of the strangers at the Iron Horse had triggered every alarm in Dale's elaborate security system. Their vehicles were too clean, their weapons too professional, and their knowledge of tactical procedures too sophisticated for civilian bikers. In Dale's paranoid worldview, they could only be federal agents conducting some kind of elaborate sting operation designed to penetrate the Iron Wolves' criminal enterprises. "We need to get out of here," Dale whispered to his brother, his voice tight with the controlled panic that had kept him alive in a business where mistakes were usually fatal. "These guys are federal, DEA, FBI, maybe ATF. This whole thing is a setup." Crash's response was complicated by his own assessment of the situation, which had reached similar conclusions through entirely different reasoning. The strangers did indeed display the professional competence of federal agents, but their behavior was wrong for an undercover operation. Real agents would have been more careful to blend in, would have avoided the kind of dramatic confrontations that drew attention and created witnesses. The third layer of opposition was more subtle, but potentially more dangerous than either the Iron Wolves' muscle or their criminal connections. Betty Kowalski had been tending bar at the Iron Horse long enough to develop her own network of contacts and informants, relationships that gave her access to information that law enforcement agencies would have paid handsomely to obtain. Her survival in a business that attracted violent men with authority issues was due partly to her ability to read situations before they became deadly, but mostly to her willingness to trade information when trading became necessary for self-preservation. She'd provided alibis for murderers, had laundered money for drug dealers, and had served as a neutral meeting ground for negotiations between rival criminal organizations. But Betty's primary loyalty was to her own survival, and she'd learned to recognize when her establishment was about to become the scene of violence that would attract unwanted attention from law enforcement. The confrontation brewing between the strangers and the Iron Wolves had all the hallmarks of the kind of incident that would bring federal investigators to her door, asking questions about customers she'd rather not discuss. She'd already begun the process of protecting herself, quietly photographing the strangers with her cell phone and uploading the images to a secure server that she'd established years earlier for exactly this purpose. If the Iron Horse became a crime scene, she'd have evidence to trade for immunity or reduced charges, along with detailed records of every conversation she'd overheard and every transaction she'd witnessed. The most dangerous opposition, however, came from Vincent Blackwood himself, whose presence at the reunion suggested motivations that went far beyond simple revenge or personal vendetta. His casual revelation of the surveillance photographs indicated resources and planning that suggested backing from organizations with budgets measured in millions rather than thousands. Blackwood's conversation with Marcus had been carefully choreographed to achieve maximum psychological impact, but his real audience wasn't the man sitting at the bar. Every word had been chosen to send messages to the other members of Team Blackout, letting them know that their civilian identities were compromised and their secret lives were no longer secret. The implications were staggering for people who'd spent more than 2 decades building new lives based on the assumption that their military service was buried in classified files that would never see daylight. Sarah Mitchell's work at the VA hospital, Wire's employment with telecommunications companies, Ghost's involvement in private security, all of it had been documented and analyzed by people with the resources to destroy their carefully constructed facades. But Blackwood's ultimate goal wasn't blackmail or extortion, it was recruitment. The surveillance had been designed to demonstrate vulnerability rather than to exploit it, showing the survivors of Mountain Thunder that their only safety lay in cooperation with whoever was backing Blackwood's operation. The reunion at the Iron Horse was a job interview conducted at gunpoint, an offer of employment that couldn't be refused because the alternative was exposure and destruction. The fourth tier of opposition was the most insidious because it came from within the team itself, in the form of suspicions and resentments that had been festering for 23 years. Each member of Team Blackout had built their civilian life around their own version of what had happened during Operation Mountain Thunder, and those versions didn't necessarily align with objective reality or with each other's memories. Marcus had spent 2 decades believing that he'd been responsible for his team's deaths, But Wire's survival suggested that the mission's failure might have been due to factors beyond any individual's control. Sarah's work at the VA hospital indicated that she'd channeled her guilt into helping other veterans, but it also suggested that she'd been dealing with trauma that she'd never fully processed. Ghost's involvement in private security work was either a natural extension of his military skills or evidence that he'd never successfully transitioned to civilian life, depending on how you interpreted his motivations. And Wire's employment with telecommunications companies could be seen as either a logical application of his technical expertise or as preparation for some future operation that required access to communication networks. The reunion was forcing each of them to confront not just the buried secrets of their shared past, but the lies they'd been telling themselves about their individual futures. The comfortable narratives they'd constructed about their civilian lives were being challenged by the reality of what they'd accomplished together and the implications of what they might be asked to do again. The tension in the Iron Horse was becoming palpable as these various factions assessed each other and calculated their options. The motorcycle club's leadership was split between those who wanted to assert their territorial dominance and those who recognized that they were facing opposition beyond their ability to handle. The criminal elements were preparing to flee rather than risk exposure, while the neutral parties were trying to determine which side offered the best chance of survival. In the eye of this developing storm, Marcus Rodriguez was coming to terms with the realization that his 23-year exile was ending whether he wanted it to or not. The choice was no longer between civilian obscurity and military service. It was between cooperation and destruction, between accepting Blackwood's offer and watching everything he'd built since Afghanistan crumble under scrutiny that he couldn't survive. The game had begun in earnest, and the stakes were nothing less than the rest of their lives. Part 5. Catalyst Moment and Game Changer. Extended the moment that transformed the Iron Horse from a simple biker bar into the epicenter of something much larger came when Tommy O'Brien made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As he watched the tactical ballet unfolding between the strangers and his own people, he realized that his establishment was about to become collateral damage in a conflict that had nothing to do with motorcycle clubs or territorial disputes. The phone call he'd made to Wire had been instinctive, born from a debt of gratitude that went back 5 years to a night in Billings when a drug deal had gone catastrophically wrong. Tommy had been trying to establish the Iron Wolves as players in the regional methamphetamine trade, and he'd arranged to purchase 10 pounds of crystal from a supplier with connections to Mexican cartels. The meeting had been set for a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, and Tommy had brought 3 of his best men as backup. What they'd walked into was an ambush, orchestrated by a rival organization that had decided the Iron Wolves were becoming too successful for their own good. The gunfight had lasted 15 minutes, and had left 2 of Tommy's men dead and himself wounded in the shoulder. He'd been pinned down behind a forklift, bleeding and running low on ammunition, when a stranger had appeared in the warehouse like a ghost, materializing from shadow. The man who'd saved Tommy's life that night had moved through the hostile territory with the fluid grace of someone who'd done this kind of work professionally. He'd eliminated 3 gunmen with surgical precision, had extracted Tommy from the warehouse, and had provided basic medical care until professional help arrived. When Tommy had tried to thank him, the stranger had simply said his name was Wire and had given him a pendant identical to the one now hanging from Marcus Rodriguez's motorcycle. "If you ever see another one of these," Wire had said, "you help whoever's wearing it. No questions, no conditions, no exceptions. That's how it works." Tommy had worn the pendant for 5 years without seeing another one, had sometimes wondered if Wire had been some kind of hallucination brought on by blood loss and adrenaline. But now, faced with Marcus and his mysterious antagonist, he was beginning to understand that he'd been drafted into something much larger than a simple debt of gratitude. The phone call that summoned Wire to the Iron Horse had been the first domino in a chain reaction that was about to reshape the landscape of power in this part of Montana. Within minutes of hanging up, Tommy's cell phone had begun receiving text messages from numbers he didn't recognize, cryptic communications that suggested his establishment was now under surveillance by multiple interested parties. The first message had come from a blocked number: "Package delivered. Maintain position. Do not interfere." The second had arrived 30 seconds later from a different source: "Federal assets inbound. Secure all physical evidence. The third message was the most chilling. Cleanup crew standing by. Await authorization. Tommy realized with growing horror that his bar had become the center of an operation that involved resources far beyond anything he'd ever encountered. The casual way that multiple organizations were coordinating their response suggested that the confrontation between Marcus and Blackwood was the culmination of planning that had been years in the making. But the real catalyst moment came when Sarah Doc Mitchell stepped forward to examine Rico Valdez, who was still rubbing his throat and trying to recover his dignity after his brief encounter with Marcus's combat skills. What she saw in his eyes made her reach immediately for the medical bag she carried everywhere, her trained instincts recognizing symptoms that had nothing to do with physical trauma. "How long have you been using?" she asked Rico quietly, her voice carrying the professional authority of someone who'd seen every variation of human self-destruction that military service could produce. Rico's response was immediate and defensive. "I don't know what you're talking about, lady. I'm fine." But Sarah's examination had revealed the telltale signs of methamphetamine abuse. The dilated pupils, the rapid heartbeat, the tremor in his hands that he was trying to control through conscious effort. More troubling was the injection site on his left arm, partially hidden by a tattoo but visible to someone who knew what to look for. "This isn't recreational use," Sarah said to Marcus, her voice low enough that only the immediate group could hear. "This is injection site maintenance. Someone's been keeping him functional, not getting him high." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. Rico wasn't just a young biker with anger management issues. He was a test subject, someone who'd been dosed with controlled substances to monitor his reactions under stress. The confrontation that had seemed like typical barroom stupidity was actually a carefully orchestrated experiment designed to gauge how Marcus would respond to civilian threats. Wire caught Sarah's meaning immediately, his technical background giving him insights into the kind of research that would require human test subjects. "Behavioral modification," he said grimly. "Someone's been studying aggression triggers and response patterns." Ghost's contribution to the analysis was characteristically blunt, "which means they've been planning this reunion for a lot longer than we thought. Long enough to recruit local assets and establish testing protocols." The revelation transformed their understanding of the entire situation. Blackwood's presence at the Iron Horse wasn't opportunistic. It was the final phase of an operation that had been running for months or possibly years. Rico's attack on Marcus hadn't been spontaneous. It had been programmed. A chemical-induced rage reaction designed to test Marcus's current capabilities and psychological state. Dale Morrison's paranoid assessment of the situation suddenly seemed less like mental illness and more like accurate threat evaluation. The strangers at the bar weren't federal agents conducting a sting operation. They were subjects in a psychological experiment being conducted by people with resources that dwarfed anything law enforcement could bring to bear. But the true scope of the operation became clear when Wire's technical expertise allowed him to identify the source of the text messages that Tommy had been receiving. Using equipment that he'd pulled from his motorcycle saddlebags, Wire was able to trace the communications to a mobile command center, parked approximately 3 miles from the Iron Horse. "Military-grade equipment," Wire reported after completing his scan. "Satellite uplinks, encrypted communications, probably a full tactical operations center. Whatever's happening here, it's being coordinated by people with serious backing." The mobile command center represented a level of resources that suggested involvement by intelligence agencies or private military contractors with government contracts. The kind of people who had budgets measured in hundreds of millions, and who operated under legal frameworks that made conventional law enforcement irrelevant. Blackwood's smile widened as he watched the team process this information, clearly enjoying their growing understanding of how thoroughly they'd been manipulated. "I told you this was a reunion," he said conversationally. "I just didn't mention that we weren't the only ones invited to the party." The catalyst moment was completed when Marcus made the connection between Blackwood's surveillance photographs and the research being conducted on Rico and probably other Iron Wolves members. The pictures of Sarah at the VA hospital weren't just documentation of her civilian life. They were reconnaissance for a recruitment operation that had been tailored specifically to exploit her sense of obligation to fellow veterans. Similarly, The photographs of Wire working on cell towers represented more than simple surveillance. Someone had been studying his technical capabilities and his access to communication infrastructure, evaluating whether his skills could be useful for operations that required manipulation of electronic systems. The reunion at the Iron Horse was the culmination of a sophisticated intelligence operation designed to assess whether the survivors of Team Blackout could be reactivated for missions that their official military service had never prepared them for. The years of civilian life hadn't been exile. They'd been extended training, allowing each of them to develop skills and establish cover identities that made them more valuable as operatives than they'd ever been as soldiers. Marcus felt the familiar weight of tactical decision-making settling over his mind as he processed the implications of their situation. They were faced with opponents who had superior resources, better intelligence, and the advantage of preparation. Conventional resistance would be futile. Their only hope lay in using their individual skills and collective experience to turn the operation against itself. But first, they needed to understand exactly what they were being recruited for, and who was doing the recruiting. The answers to those questions would determine whether cooperation was possible, or whether they'd have to fight their way out of a trap that had been 23 years in the making. The storm outside was growing stronger, and the first snowflakes were beginning to fall against the Iron Horse's windows, adding another layer of isolation to their increasingly desperate situation. The blizzard that had been threatening all evening finally arrived with the fury of a Montana winter unleashed. Snow drove against the Iron Horse's windows with the force of thrown gravel, while the wind howled through the gaps in the log walls like voices of the damned. Inside the saloon, the temperature had dropped noticeably despite the struggling heating system, and the amber lights seemed dimmer somehow, as if the storm was draining the very life from the building. Marcus Rodriguez stood at the center of what had become a war council, his reunited team forming a loose circle around the bar, while the Iron Wolves membership watched from the shadows with the wary attention of people who'd suddenly found themselves extras in someone else's movie. The transformation from casual reunion to tactical planning session had been swift and decisive, driven by the growing understanding that their situation was far more complex and dangerous than any of them had initially realized. Vincent Blackwood remained seated at his original position, but his casual demeanor had been replaced by something more focused and predatory. The revelation that Rico Valdez had been chemically manipulated into attacking Marcus had stripped away the last pretense of coincidence, confirming what everyone in the room had begun to suspect. This entire confrontation had been orchestrated with surgical precision by people with resources that dwarfed anything a small-town motorcycle club could comprehend. "The mobile command center is moving," Wire reported, his fingers dancing across a tablet that looked like standard civilian equipment, but had been modified with military-grade enhancements. 3 vehicles, heading this way. ETA approximately 15 minutes, assuming they don't get bogged down in the snow. Sarah Mitchell had completed her examination of Rico and confirmed what they'd all feared. The young biker had been systematically dosed with a cocktail of stimulants and behavioral modifiers that had turned him into an unwitting test subject. The injection sites on his arms told the story of weeks or possibly months of chemical conditioning, a sophisticated program designed to make him aggressive and unpredictable when triggered by specific stimuli. "This isn't just recruitment," Sarah said, her voice tight with professional anger. "This is human experimentation. Whoever's running this operation has been using the Iron Wolves as a laboratory, testing chemical compounds and psychological manipulation techniques on people who trusted them." Ghost Chen had been conducting his own reconnaissance, using skills honed during years of penetrating hostile territory to assess their tactical situation. His report was grimly professional. "Building has 6 exits, but 3 are blocked by snowdrifts. Weapons cache behind the bar includes 2 shotguns and a rifle, plus whatever the club members are carrying. Ammunition is limited, maybe 60 rounds total." Tommy O'Brien felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. His decision to call Wire had set this confrontation in motion, and now his establishment was about to become a battlefield between forces he didn't understand and couldn't control. The pendant beneath his shirt felt like it was burning against his skin, a constant reminder that he'd been drafted into a war that had started long before he'd ever heard of Delta Force Team Blackout. "There's something else," Dale Morrison said, his paranoid instincts finally proving useful. "The phone lines went down 20 minutes ago. Cell towers are being jammed. We're completely cut off from the outside world." The isolation was strategic rather than accidental, Marcus realized. Whoever was coordinating this operation had spent considerable time and resources ensuring that the Iron Horse would become an island, a place where violence could occur without interference from law enforcement or civilian witnesses. The approaching blizzard was just the final element in a plan that had probably been years in the making. Blackwood finally stood, his movement fluid and controlled despite the tension crackling through the room. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who'd never learned to doubt his own importance. "You're all thinking about this wrong," he said. "This isn't a trap. It's an opportunity." Marcus felt the familiar surge of combat adrenaline beginning to course through his system, the chemical cocktail that had kept him alive through 3 tours of deployment in places where hesitation meant death. Opportunity for what? "To finish what we started in Afghanistan," Blackwood replied. "Operation Mountain Thunder wasn't a failure. It was the beginning of something much larger, something that your narrow military perspective couldn't comprehend at the time." Sarah's medical training allowed her to recognize the signs of psychological manipulation, even as they were being deployed. Blackwood's words were carefully chosen to exploit their shared guilt and unresolved trauma, using their emotional vulnerabilities as weapons against their rational judgment. "You're talking about the mission that got half our team killed," she said flatly. "I'm talking about the mission that saved American lives and prevented a terrorist attack that would have made 9/11 look like a training exercise," Blackwood shot back. "The asset we extracted from that Afghan compound had intelligence about sleeper cells operating in major American cities. The information we recovered prevented bombings in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago." Wyer's technical background made him naturally skeptical of claims that couldn't be verified through documentation. If that's true, why is it still classified? Why has there never been any recognition of what we accomplished? Blackwood's smile was sharp as a blade. "Because the people we stopped were being funded by the same government agencies that sent us to stop them. Because Operation Mountain Thunder exposed a network of corruption that went all the way to the highest levels of the intelligence community. Because the truth would have brought down administrations and destroyed careers that were worth more to certain people than justice or accountability." The revelation hit the team like a physical blow, recontextualizing everything they thought they knew about their service and their sacrifice. If Blackwood was telling the truth, then their mission hadn't been a simple extraction operation. It had been a surgical strike against American intelligence assets who'd been playing both sides of the war on terror for their own profit. Ghost's voice was deadly quiet when he spoke. "You're saying we were sent to clean up someone else's mess. That our people died because politicians were covering their tracks. I'm saying that your people died because they stumbled onto evidence that certain powerful individuals were profiting from prolonged conflict in Afghanistan. The asset we were supposed to extract wasn't just a source of intelligence. He was a witness to transactions that could have exposed the entire network." Marcus felt pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered for 23 years suddenly clicking into place. The strange orders they'd received, the lack of backup when things went wrong, the way their mission had been buried in classification levels that made it invisible even to congressional oversight. All of it made sense if Operation Mountain Thunder had been designed to eliminate evidence rather than gather intelligence. "The compound we hit," Marcus said slowly, "it wasn't an insurgent safe house, it was a meeting place. The people we killed weren't terrorists. They were witnesses." Blackwood nodded approvingly. "Now you're beginning to understand. The asset we extracted had documentation of payments made to Taliban commanders by American contractors, records of weapons shipments that were being sold to both sides of the conflict, evidence of systematic fraud that was stealing billions from the defense budget." Sarah's hands were trembling with suppressed rage as the implications became clear. "So they sent us in to murder the people who could expose them. They turned us into assassins without telling us what we were really doing." "They turned you into patriots," Blackwood corrected. "The people you killed were traitors who were selling American lives for profit." The network they were part of was responsible for extending the war in Afghanistan by years, for the deaths of thousands of American soldiers who died so that defense contractors could maximize their profits. Wire's analytical mind was working through the logical implications of what they were being told. If this is all true, why are you telling us now? What's changed after 23 years? The answer came not from Blackwood, but from the sound of vehicles approaching through the storm, their engines barely audible above the howling wind, but unmistakably moving with purpose toward the Iron Horse. Through the frosted windows, they could see headlights cutting through the driving snow, at least 3 sets of lights moving in tactical formation. What's changed, Blackwood said, is that the network we thought we'd destroyed has rebuilt itself. The people who profited from the Afghanistan conflict have moved on to new wars, new opportunities for profit. Ukraine, Syria, Yemen, wherever American military intervention creates opportunities for private contractors to profit from prolonged conflict. Betty Kowalski had been listening to the conversation while continuing to clean glasses, her survival instincts telling her to maintain the illusion of normalcy, even as her world crumbled around her. But the approaching vehicles represented a threat that couldn't be ignored through simple denial. "Those aren't police cars," she said grimly. "Police don't move like that." Crash Morrison had positioned himself near the front windows, his combat experience allowing him to read the tactical signs that civilian eyes would miss. 3 vehicles, maybe 4 people per vehicle. Professional spacing, coordinated movement. These aren't federal agents coming to make arrests. They're soldiers coming to finish a job. The Iron Wolves membership was beginning to understand that their territorial disputes and criminal enterprises were trivial compared to the forces that were converging on their sanctuary. Men who'd thought they were dangerous because they carried knives and rode motorcycles were discovering that they were children playing with toys compared to professionals who killed for reasons that transcended personal grudges or financial gain. Marcus felt the weight of command settling on his shoulders again, the familiar burden of making decisions that would determine who lived and who died. His civilian life was over, he realized. The moment he'd walked into the Iron Horse, he'd stepped back into a war that had never really ended, had only been waiting for the right moment to reclaim him. "What do you want from us?" he asked Blackwood directly. "I want you to finish the job you started 23 years ago. The network that sent us to Afghanistan has evolved, has learned from its mistakes, but it's still vulnerable to the same kind of surgical strike that Operation Mountain Thunder represented. One team, one mission. One chance to cut the head off a serpent that's been feeding on American blood for decades." Sarah's medical oath compelled her to preserve life, but her military training had taught her that sometimes preserving innocent life required taking guilty life. "Who are the targets?" Blackwood reached into his jacket and produced a folder that he placed on the bar with the reverence of someone handling a sacred text. Inside were photographs, documents, and financial records that painted a picture of corruption so vast and systematic that it dwarfed anything they'd encountered during their military service. Defense contractors who had been selling weapons to both sides of every conflict since Afghanistan. Politicians who have been taking payments to ensure that peace negotiations fail. Intelligence officers who've been protecting terrorist networks because destroying them would eliminate profitable opportunities for intervention. Wire studied the documents with the methodical attention of someone trained to spot forgeries and fabrications. What he found was evidence that appeared genuine, cross-referenced through multiple sources, and verified through banking records that would be impossible to fake. "This is real," he said quietly. "All of it." Ghost's assessment was characteristically blunt. "Targets are high value, well protected, probably have security details that rival presidential protection. This isn't a mission, it's a suicide run. It's a mission that requires people with your particular skills and your specific motivation," Blackwood replied. "People who understand the cost of betrayal because they've lived with it for 23 years. People who have nothing left to lose because they've already lost everything that mattered." The vehicles outside had stopped, their engines cutting off in unison with the precision of a military operation. Through the storm, they could see figures moving with tactical efficiency, surrounding the Iron Horse and cutting off all possible escape routes. The mobile command center that Wire had detected earlier was probably coordinating the operation, turning the saloon into a killing ground that would eliminate all witnesses to what was about to unfold. Marcus looked around the room, taking in the faces of his teammates and the civilians who'd been caught in the crossfire of a war they'd never chosen to join. Tommy O'Brien was gripping his baseball bat with white knuckles, his Iron Wolves loyalty warring with his survival instincts. Betty Kowalski had stopped pretending to work and was frankly calculating her chances of living through the next hour. The remaining club members were looking to Crash Morrison for leadership, but even the big man seemed uncertain about how to handle opponents who moved with military precision. "The people outside," Marcus said to Blackwood, "they're not here to recruit us. They're here to eliminate us." Blackwood's smile was cold as Arctic wind. "That depends entirely on your answer. Cooperation ensures survival. Resistance guarantees death. The choice has always been yours to make." The sound of boots crunching through snow was audible now, multiple teams moving to establish overlapping fields of fire that would turn the Iron Horse into a slaughterhouse if violence erupted. Professional killers were taking positions around the building, people who'd been trained to eliminate threats with efficiency and ruthlessness that made the Iron Wolves' criminal activities look like playground disputes. Wire had been monitoring communications using equipment that looked like a standard smartphone, but had been enhanced with military-grade capabilities. "I'm picking up tactical frequencies," he reported. "Team leaders coordinating final positions. They're not planning to take prisoners." Sarah's medical training included extensive study of trauma patterns, knowledge that allowed her to understand exactly what kinds of weapons were being deployed against them. "High-velocity rounds," she said grimly, "designed to cause maximum tissue damage. They're not planning to leave survivors to tell stories." Marcus felt the familiar calm settling over him that had always preceded combat, the mental state that allowed him to function effectively while other people were paralyzed by fear or overwhelmed by adrenaline. He'd spent 23 years trying to forget these skills, but they returned with the reliability of muscle memory, as natural as breathing and twice as necessary. "Tommy," he said to the Iron Wolves leader, "get your people to the back of the building. Find whatever cover you can, and stay down until this is over." Tommy's response surprised everyone in the room. "Like hell. This is my place, and these are my people. We don't run from fights." Crash Morrison's assessment was more practical. "We don't win fights against professionals either, but we can make them pay for every step they take." The solidarity was touching, but tactically meaningless, Marcus knew. Civilian bikers with hunting rifles and handguns wouldn't last 30 seconds against professional operators with military-grade equipment and extensive training. The only chance any of them had was if Team Blackout could neutralize the external threat before it breached the building's defenses. But that would require accepting Blackwood's proposal, taking on a mission that would almost certainly be their last, regardless of whether they succeeded or failed. The targets he'd identified were protected by security apparatus that made presidential details look casual, and the evidence against them was so damning that they'd kill anyone who threatened to expose their activities. The choice wasn't really between cooperation and resistance. It was between dying as soldiers fighting for a cause they believed in, or dying as civilians trapped in someone else's war. Marcus had spent 23 years running from that choice, but now it had found him anyway, had tracked him to a bar in the middle of Montana, where the past and present were about to collide with lethal force. Outside, the storm was reaching blizzard intensity, but the professionals surrounding the Iron Horse were moving with the inexorable precision of people who'd learned to operate in hostile environments. Snow and wind might slow them down, but it wouldn't stop them from completing their mission. Marcus made his decision with the same cold calculation that had kept him alive through 3 tours of combat. "We'll take the job," he told Blackwood. "But first we deal with the people outside." Blackwood's approval was evident in his smile. "I was hoping you'd see it that way. The weapons cache is in the basement, along with equipment that should level the playing field considerably." The basement of the Iron Horse contained enough military hardware to outfit a small army, Marcus discovered as they descended the narrow wooden stairs. Assault rifles, body armor, night vision equipment, explosives, everything they'd need to turn the saloon into a fortress that could withstand a prolonged siege. But the real surprise was the tunnel system that connected the Iron Horse to buildings throughout the town, an underground network that had been constructed during the Cold War and expanded by subsequent owners who'd understood the value of having multiple escape routes. The tunnels would allow them to move undetected, to strike at their opponents from unexpected directions, while avoiding the killing ground that the saloon had become. Wyer's technical expertise came into play as he studied the tunnel schematics, identifying weak points in the enemy's perimeter and opportunities for flanking maneuvers that would exploit their opponent's assumptions about the battlefield. "They're expecting us to be trapped in here," he said. "They're not prepared for a mobile defense." Sarah's medical training included combat casualty care, skills that would be essential if they were going to survive the coming firefight. She established an aid station in the basement's most protected corner, laying out supplies and equipment with the efficiency of someone who'd done this work under fire before. Ghost's reconnaissance capabilities allowed him to map the enemy positions using techniques that had been perfected during years of operating behind enemy lines. 12 hostiles confirmed, he reported. Standard tactical formation, but they're relying too heavily on their equipment. They're not expecting serious resistance from what they think are civilian targets. The mistake would be costly for the professionals outside, Marcus realized. They'd prepared for a simple elimination operation, not a firefight against opponents who understood their tactics and had access to equipment that matched their own. The Iron Horse was about to become the site of a battle that would determine not just their immediate survival, but the future of a war that had been raging in shadows for more than 2 decades. As they prepared for combat, Marcus felt a strange sense of completion, as if the 23 years of civilian life had been nothing more than an intermission in a play that was finally resuming. The guilt and self-recrimination that had defined his post-military existence were being replaced by the cold fury of a professional soldier who'd been betrayed by the very people he'd sworn to serve. The storm outside was nature's fury, but the storm inside the Iron Horse was human rage, refined into lethal purpose. Team Blackout was back in business, and their first order of business was teaching their opponents that some ghosts were more dangerous than the living. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.